The gun was already pressed against Edgar Hadley's temple when Frances Gentry walked through the saloon door. She had not expected this. She had expected a quiet conversation, a handshake perhaps, the kind of civilized negotiation that men in dusty towns pretended to conduct before they reached for their weapons anyway. But there was nothing civilized about what she saw. Silas Croft, the man who had ruined her family, who had stolen her father's land with forged documents and bribed judges, stood with his thick fingers wrapped around the handle of a Navy Colt, pressing its cold barrel against the skull of the one man in all of Redemption, Texas, who had ever looked at her like she was worth saving. Edgar's jaw was tight. His gray eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a hard freeze, found her the moment she stepped inside. He did not beg. He did not flinch. He just looked at her with an expression she had no name for, something between apology and absolute certainty, as if he had known this moment was coming and had chosen to walk into it anyway. "Close the door, Miss Gentry," Silas said, and his voice was like gravel rolling down a tin roof. "You are exactly the person I wanted to see." The saloon was empty except for the three of them and a barkeep who had pressed himself so far against the back wall he had nearly become part of the woodwork. Outside, the main street of Redemption baked under a July sun that showed no mercy. Inside, the air tasted like old whiskey and danger, and the particular kind of silence that comes before something irreversible. Frances did not close the door. She stepped further into the room and let the afternoon light cut across the sawdust floor behind her, because she had learned long ago that you never let a man like Silas Croft trap you in a dark space. "Whatever you want from me," she said, keeping her voice steady even as her heart threatened to break out of her chest. "Let him go first." Silas laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Now why would I do that? Mr. Hadley here has been a considerable inconvenience to me. He filed those papers with the Federal Land Office. He rode all the way to Austin on your behalf. He has made himself your champion, and champions, Miss Gentry, tend to be very useful as leverage." Edgar's eyes never left her face. Even now, with a gun against his head, he was trying to tell her something with that steady gaze. She thought she understood. He was telling her not to give Silas what he wanted. He was telling her that whatever she had to sacrifice, it should not be the truth. She had known Edgar Hadley for exactly 4 months. It felt like a lifetime, and it also felt like no time at all. 4 months ago, she had arrived in Redemption with a carpetbag, a legal brief she barely understood, and enough anger to fuel a locomotive. She had not been looking for a partner. She had certainly not been looking for love. She had been looking for justice. And she had believed, in the rigid and solitary way that grief sometimes makes a person believe, that she could find it alone. She had been wrong about a great many things in those first weeks. The town of Redemption sat in the hill country of central Texas, in the year 1878, at a crossroads between the old cattle trail world and the new railroad world that was slowly swallowing everything that came before it. The Southern Pacific had not yet reached this far, but everyone knew it was coming, and everyone with any sense knew that the land it would cross would be worth a fortune. That was what this was all about in the end. That was what it had always been about. Frances's father, Robert Gentry, had homesteaded 300 acres of that land in 1861, before the war had taken everything sideways. He had built a house on it, raised cattle, planted a peach orchard along the creek bottom, and raised Frances and her younger brother Thomas there after their mother died of fever in 1869. Robert Gentry had died in the spring of 1878, quietly in his own bed, of a heart that had simply worked itself past the point of repair. He had died believing his land was safe and his daughter would inherit it clean. He had not known about the documents. Frances discovered them 6 weeks after his burial, when a man from the county surveyor's office came to the house with 2 deputies and a folded piece of paper that claimed Robert Gentry had sold the 300 acres to the Croft Land and Cattle Company in February of 1876. The signature was her father's name. The handwriting was not her father's hand. She had known it immediately, the way you know a forgery of someone you love. The letters were too careful, too even. Her father had written with a slight leftward lean his entire life, a quirk from a childhood injury to his right hand. The signature on that document was perfectly upright. They gave her 2 weeks to vacate the property. She had packed what she could carry, arranged for Thomas, who was 22 and working a cattle drive up toward Kansas, to be contacted by letter, and she had ridden into Redemption to find a lawyer. The only lawyer in Redemption was Edgar Hadley. She had not been impressed, not at first. His office was above the hardware store, accessible by a set of outside stairs that creaked so alarmingly she was surprised they held her weight. The office itself was small and crowded with books and papers stacked in towers that seemed to operate by some organizational principle known only to their owner. Edgar himself was sitting behind a desk so cluttered she could barely see him, reading something with his glasses pushed up to the bridge of his nose, one hand moving through his dark hair in an absent, distracted gesture that suggested he had entirely forgotten the world outside his reading. He was younger than she had expected. She had assumed a lawyer in a small Texas town would be gray-haired and careful, the kind of man who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. Edgar Hadley was 31 years old, lean and sharp-featured, with those winter-sky eyes behind his wire-rimmed spectacles and ink stains on the fingers of his right hand that no amount of washing seemed to fully remove. He looked more like a man who had run from a university than one who had grown up in frontier country. He had, as she would learn later, done exactly that. "Miss Gentry," he said, standing when she came in because whatever else Edgar Hadley was, he had the manners of someone who had been raised with intention. "Sit down, please. Tell me what brings you here," she told him. She put the copied documents on his desk, the ones she had managed to take before the deputies arrived, along with the dates and the names and the signature discrepancy she had noticed. She watched his face as he read, because Frances had learned to read people's reactions the way some people read weather. She was looking for dismissal, for the particular kind of condescension she had already encountered twice in Redemption, once from the county clerk and once from the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Dolan who was, she was increasingly certain, in Silas Croft's pocket. Edgar did not dismiss her. He read everything twice slowly, and then he took his glasses off and set them on the desk and looked at her with an expression of focused intensity that she found, despite herself, oddly reassuring. "The signature lean," he said. "You noticed it immediately. My father had a particular way of writing. I have letters from him going back 15 years. The lean is consistent in every one. Do you have any of those letters with you?" She had thought to bring 3. She set them on his desk. He compared them to the document copy without speaking for a long moment. "This is forgery," he said finally, with the flat certainty of someone stating a fact rather than an opinion. "A careful one, but a forgery nonetheless. Someone studied your father's handwriting. They got most of it right, but whoever did this was copying from a limited sample, probably 1 or 2 letters at most, not 15 years of correspondence. Can you help me?" He looked at her over the documents with those steady gray eyes and said something she had not expected. "I can try. I want you to understand clearly that Silas Croft is the most powerful man in this county, that Judge Paris has ruled in his favor in 14 consecutive land disputes over the past 3 years, and that 2 lawyers who previously took cases against Croft have since relocated from Redemption under circumstances I would describe as pressured. I am telling you this not to discourage you, but because you deserve to know the landscape you are walking into." "I know the landscape," Frances said. "I grew up on the edge of it." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then he nodded and reached for a clean sheet of paper. "All right then, let us start at the beginning." That had been the beginning. What followed was 4 months of work so close and constant that Frances came to know the patterns of Edgar's thinking the way she knew the patterns of rain on a familiar roof. He was methodical and precise and occasionally brilliant, with a legal mind that could hold 20 threads at once and follow each one without losing the others. He was also deeply private, the kind of man who answered questions about himself with other questions, who deflected personal conversation with such practiced ease that it took her weeks to realize he was doing it deliberately. She learned pieces of him in fragments, the way you learn a landscape by moonlight, one piece at a time. He was from Virginia originally, from a family that had money before the war and very little afterward. He had studied law at the University of Virginia, completed his education in 1868, and then done something unexpected. He had gone west instead of building a comfortable practice among the ruins of Eastern society. He had practiced law in St. Louis for 2 years, then in Kansas City, then gradually moved south and west through a series of towns until he ended up in Redemption in 1875, where he had been ever since. He did not talk about why he had kept moving, and she did not push him on it, not yet. What she knew for certain was that he was honest in a way that felt almost inconvenient in a country where honesty and survival did not always run together. He had turned down a case the week after she arrived because, he explained simply, the client had lied to him in their first meeting, and he did not work with people who lied. He charged Frances less than his standard fee without mentioning it, and when she noticed and asked him about it, he looked briefly uncomfortable and said that it seemed the appropriate rate given the circumstances. And she understood that the circumstances he meant were that she was sleeping in one room at Mrs. Pullen's boarding house and eating one proper meal a day to preserve what was left of her father's savings. She did not thank him in a way that embarrassed either of them. She simply accepted it, and she thought about it later, alone, and felt something shift in the way she looked at him. The case was harder than even Edgar's initial warnings had suggested. The forged deed had been filed with the county clerk with enough apparent legitimacy that challenging it required evidence of forgery beyond mere handwriting comparison, which any halfway competent lawyer for Croft could argue was subjective. They needed a witness, someone who had been present when Croft's people had forged the document, or someone who could speak to Robert Gentry's state of knowledge in 1876, confirming he had never signed any such agreement. Thomas Gentry came back from the cattle drive in late June, taller and trail-worn, and furious in the quiet, contained way that Frances recognized as the family disposition. He corroborated everything Frances had said and added his own testimony that their father had specifically mentioned, in a letter Thomas still had, that he had been approached about selling and had refused absolutely, calling the offer an insult to everything he had built. That letter was crucial. Edgar spent an entire evening in his office with it, reading it in the lamplight while Frances sat across the desk from him and tried to read the case notes upside down, a habit she had developed over the previous 2 months. The lamp threw a warm circle of light between them, and the night insects called outside the open window, and the town settled into its evening sounds, and she realized at some point that she had stopped trying to read the case notes, and was instead watching the way the lamplight moved across Edgar's face when he turned a page. It was a dangerous realization, and she filed it away carefully, the way you file away something you are not yet ready to examine. Edgar looked up and caught her watching him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "This letter changes things significantly," he said finally, as if no moment had passed at all, as if neither of them had felt the sudden warmth that had pressed into the air between them like a hand against a window. "The date confirms your father was aware of Croft's offer and explicitly refused it, in writing, 6 months before the alleged sale. That creates a documented contradiction that is very difficult to explain away." "Good," Frances said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I am going to need to ride to Austin," Edgar said. "The Federal Land Office has jurisdiction here because the original homestead was filed under federal statute. If I can get the right examiner to look at this, to compare the signature against the federal filing from 1861, we can make a case that bypasses Judge Paris entirely. It will take time, 2 weeks at minimum. Then go, she said. I will be here. He left the next morning, and Frances discovered, in his absence, something she had been trying very hard not to discover. She missed him, not in a vague, general way. She missed the specific weight of his presence, the sound of his voice when he was working through a legal argument, the way he always made a second cup of coffee without asking whether she wanted one. She missed the feeling of working alongside someone who took her intelligence seriously, who argued with her when he thought she was wrong, and was not surprised when she argued back. She had been self-sufficient her entire adult life by necessity. She had run her father's ranch with the help of 2 hired hands after Thomas left on his first cattle drive, had managed the books and negotiated the cattle sales, and handled every piece of practical difficulty that the frontier presented with a competence born of having no other option. She was not a woman who needed anyone. She had been quite clear about this in her own mind for a long time. It turned out that not needing someone and not wanting them were 2 entirely different things. Edgar came back from Austin 11 days after he left, 3 days earlier than planned, with a federal examiner's written preliminary finding of probable signature fraud and a letter authorizing a full investigation. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon while Frances was at the courthouse reviewing the land. Records the clerk had finally, after much pressure, agreed to let her examine. She heard his horse in the street outside and looked up through the courthouse window and saw him dismounting, still trail dusty from the road. She was outside before she had fully decided to move. He saw her coming down the courthouse steps and something changed in his face, a brief, unguarded softening that he controlled almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. "You came back early," she said. "The examiner was cooperative. I did not see the point in delay." "What did you find?" he told her, standing in the heat of the courthouse square, not waiting for shade or a chair or any of the formalities that could have delayed the information by 30 seconds. That was one of the things she was coming to understand about him. He told her things directly, without making her wait for them, without arranging the delivery for his own advantage. He respected her urgency. When he finished explaining, she felt the first real loosening of the knot that had lived in her chest since the day the surveyor's man had come to her door. It was not victory yet, but it was possibility. "Edgar," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his first name without meaning to, and they had been maintaining the careful formality of Miss Gentry and Mr. Hadley for 4 months. He looked at her. "Frances," he said quietly, as if testing the way it sounded, and something settled between them that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite avoidance. Just his name in her mouth and hers in his, hanging in the hot Texas air. Then Silas Croft had made his move. She found out 2 days later that Croft had been watching. He had people watching the federal land office in Austin, apparently, because his response to Edgar's trip had been swift and decisive. 3 of his men had cornered Edgar's client in the land dispute that predated Frances's case, a cattle rancher named Holt whose case Edgar had been building alongside hers. The men had not hurt Holt physically, but they had made it clear, in the language of implication and proximity, that his continued health was contingent on his withdrawing from the case. Holt withdrew. Edgar sent him a letter saying he understood because he did. Croft's next move was more direct. He had Edgar's office broken into, some files taken, nothing that could not be reconstructed but a clear message. Edgar reported the break-in to Sheriff Dolan, who came, looked around, and wrote something in his notebook with the bored efficiency of a man performing a ritual he had no intention of following through on. "He is trying to frighten you," Frances said, sitting in Edgar's office while he assessed what had been taken. "He is succeeding somewhat," Edgar said, which surprised her, and she looked at him. "I am not above being frightened, Frances. I just do not intend to let it change my course." She did not know why that honesty struck her so deeply. She had known men who claimed to be fearless, and they had all, without exception, been either liars or fools. Here was a man who could admit to fear and stand in it without yielding, and she found this more impressive than any amount of performed bravado. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to keep filing," he said, "and I'm going to take certain precautions." The precautions included sending copies of all their key documents to a colleague in San Antonio. They also included Edgar beginning to carry a sidearm, which Frances noticed because he had not worn one before, and it changed the silhouette of him in a way that was both practical and unsettling. She began carrying her father's Colt pocket revolver, a small, reliable weapon she had been shooting since she was 16, tucked inside her skirt pocket. The weeks that followed were taut and strange, full of the particular intimacy that comes from shared danger. They worked long hours, often until midnight, in the lamplit office above the hardware store, building the case layer by layer. They ate meals together at the boarding house dining room because it was practical, and because neither of them found a compelling reason to eat apart. They argued about law and about strategy, and once, memorably, about poetry, because Edgar had a volume of Tennyson on his desk and Frances had strong opinions about Tennyson that she had not previously had occasion to express. Thomas was there through this period too, staying at the boarding house, helping where he could, running documents to the telegraph office, watching Edgar with the assessing look of an older brother that he had not technically earned but wielded with full authority. One evening, Thomas caught her alone in the boarding house parlor and sat down across from her with the directness of a man who was going to say something whether or not he was invited to. "He is a good man," Thomas said. Frances did not pretend to misunderstand. "I know. Do you like him?" "Thomas, Frances, do you like him?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the evening star was coming up in the western sky, and the smell of the neighbors' roses came in on the cooling air. "I am trying very hard not to make this complicated," she said. "We are in the middle of a legal fight. This is not the time." "You are always in the middle of something," Thomas said. "You have been in the middle of something your entire adult life. If you are waiting for the clear water, you will wait forever." She had no answer for that, so she did not give him one. But she thought about it later, alone in her room, and she did not sleep easily. The following week, Edgar asked her if she would walk with him in the evening, not to discuss the case. He specified, just to walk. She said yes with a care that was itself a kind of answer, and they walked the length of Redemption's Main Street, and then down toward the creek that ran below the town, where the cottonwood trees threw their shade over the water and the evening light turned everything amber and gold. He was quiet for a long time, and Frances, who had learned to read his silences, let him have it. "I need to tell you something," he said eventually, stopping near the creek bank where the water ran shallow over smooth limestone. "About why I keep moving. About the reason I came west in the first place." She waited. "There was a woman in Virginia," he said. "After the war, when I was finishing my law studies. We were engaged to be married. Her father disapproved of me, not of my character but of my prospects, which had declined considerably along with everyone else's during the war years. He had arranged a different match for her, a man with more money and more land than I was ever going to recover. She chose her father's arrangement." Frances said nothing. "I do not blame her," Edgar said. "She made the practical choice, but it changed something in how I thought about building a life anywhere that already had a defined social structure, where money and family history determined everything. I thought the West might be different, a place where a man's actual character counted for more than what his grandfather had owned." He paused. "I am not certain I was right about that, but I have not stopped believing it was possible." "It is possible," Frances said. "My father built everything he had from nothing. Nobody gave it to him. And someone tried to steal it from him. Yes, but it was real before they tried to take it. The building of it was real." He looked at her, and the evening light was very kind on his face, softening the sharpness and showing what was underneath, which was something earnest and complicated and entirely unguarded. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, because she wanted to hear him say it. "Because I believe you deserve to know who you have been trusting," he said, "and because I think I have been less than fully honest with myself about what this has become over the past 4 months. I did not expect this, Frances. I want you to know that. I did not come to your case with any aim beyond doing my job well." "Neither did I," she said, "come to you with any particular aim." And yet, she agreed. The creek ran over the limestone with its steady, indifferent sound, and the cottonwood leaves moved in the small breeze that came up from the water, and Edgar Hadley reached out and took Frances Gentry's hand with the careful deliberateness of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and has considered it thoroughly. She let him, more than let him. She turned her hand in his and held it, and they stood there in the golden evening light by the creek and did not say anything else, because nothing else was needed. That was 2 weeks before Silas Croft pressed a gun against Edgar's head in the Redemption Saloon. In those 2 weeks, something between them had changed from possible to definite, from the realm of careful acknowledgement into the realm of known truth, even if they had not yet fully spoken it aloud. They had eaten breakfast together every morning with a casualness that was itself a kind of intimacy. He had brought her wildflowers once, without ceremony, just set them on the table where she was working, and she had put them in a cup of water and not made it into a thing, and neither had he, and somehow that restraint made it feel more significant than if either of them had said anything grand. They had kissed once on a Wednesday evening, outside the door of the boarding house, when the street was quiet and the moths were circling the lantern above the door. It had been brief and unhurried, the kind of kiss that announces its own intention to be repeated, and Frances had gone inside afterward with her heart in a state of considerable disorder. And then Croft had made his move, the real one, the one that replaced property theft with physical threat, because the federal investigation had progressed far enough that he knew the legal fight was turning against him, and men like Silas Croft, when they begin to lose in court, do not accept the verdict gracefully. They reach for other tools. He had gotten to Edgar somehow, lured him to the saloon on the pretext of a message from the land office examiner, a fabrication that Edgar had not had time to verify before he walked through the door, and found himself in the grip of 2 of Croft's men, while Croft pressed the Navy Colt to his skull. And then Frances had come in. She had been following, at a careful distance, because something about the message had troubled her. The handwriting on the note had not matched any of the examiner's previous correspondence, and when she had gone to Edgar's office to mention this, she had found him already gone, and she had followed the direction his landlady said he had walked. Now she stood in the saloon with the afternoon sun at her back and a gun against Edgar's head, and Silas Croft looking at her with the satisfied expression of a man who believes he has won. "Here is what is going to happen," Croft said. "You are going to write a letter right now to the federal examiner in Austin, withdrawing your complaint and confirming that your father's signature on that deed is genuine. You are going to sign it in front of me, and then Mr. Hadley here is going to be free to go, and you are going to leave Redemption within 24 hours. And if I do not," Frances said. Croft cocked the hammer. The sound was very loud in the empty saloon. Edgar's jaw was still tight and his gray eyes were still on her face, and she could see him trying to tell her something, trying to communicate through his eyes alone, and what she read there was the same thing he had said to her in a different context weeks ago. "I am not above being frightened. I just do not intend to let it change my course." She put her hand into her skirt pocket. The barkeep made a sound from behind the bar, something strangled and involuntary. "Miss Gentry," Croft said with a new sharpness in his voice, "I would not do something foolish." "I am not doing anything foolish," Frances said. "I am doing something calculated." She kept her hand where it was, fingers around the grip of her father's revolver, and she looked at Silas Croft with a steadiness she pulled from somewhere below fear, from the part of her that was her father's daughter and would not yield. "You are going to lower that gun." "Why in the world would I do that?" "Because there are 2 federal marshals riding into Redemption right now," she said. Edgar sent a telegram to the marshal's office in San Antonio 4 days ago, when we received your man's forged document, the one you used to try to discredit the examiner's signature comparison. We anticipated this, Mr. Croft. We have been anticipating it for 3 weeks. The marshals are here because Edgar requested federal protection for both himself and for the witnesses in this case, and their jurisdiction supersedes Sheriff Dolan's, which you are aware of. Croft's expression did not change immediately, but his eyes moved to the door just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, and that was enough. "You are bluffing," he said. "Then look out the window," she said. He did not want to. He was a man who did not like to be maneuvered, and he recognized that he was being maneuvered, but the fear of being wrong was stronger than his pride, and he looked toward the window. Edgar moved. It was very fast and very economical. He twisted out of the grip of the man holding him on his left side, drove an elbow back into the man's solar plexus with practiced force, and put himself below Croft's gun arm in the same motion, coming up under it, and pushing the weapon toward the ceiling with both hands. The gun discharged into the ceiling plaster with a report that shook the room, and then Edgar had Croft's wrist bent at an angle that made continued gun ownership anatomically complicated, and the Navy Colt hit the floor. Frances had the pocket revolver out by then, covering the second man who had been holding Edgar, and that man looked at her, and at the small but entirely serious weapon aimed at his chest, and put his hands up with the resigned expression of someone who has assessed the situation and found it unfavorable. There was a long, loud, ringing silence. Then, from outside, the sound of horses. 2 riders in the distinctive dark coats of federal marshals pulled up in front of the saloon. Frances exhaled. The telegram had been real. She had simply not known for certain whether they would arrive in time. The marshals took Croft and his 2 men into custody on charges of aggravated assault, firearm discharge in a public space, and witness tampering, the last of which was the most serious, and would hold them while the federal forgery case proceeded. Sheriff Dolan, who arrived 12 minutes after the marshals and found the situation already resolved, seemed to be considering various responses before settling on professional cooperation as his safest option. Edgar sat down on a saloon chair when it was over, and Frances could see the fine tremor in his hands that he was controlling with effort, the physical aftermath of danger that the body announces whether you give it permission or not. She sat down across from him. The barkeep brought 2 glasses of water without being asked. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No, you." "No," she paused. "The telegram was sent 4 days ago. The moment I identified Croft's method of escalation, he met her eyes. I should have told you." "You should have," she agreed without heat. "Next time tell me," he nodded. "Next time." She looked at his hands. "You can let that shake," she said quietly. "There is no one here to manage for." He looked down at his hands and then up at her, and something in his face did something she recognized as the release of held control, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat there in the wrecked quiet of the aftermath, while the marshals' voices came in through the open door, and the afternoon went on doing what afternoons do. The federal investigation moved faster after that. Croft in custody, without his intimidation apparatus functioning freely, could no longer suppress witnesses. 2 men who had worked for the Croft Land and Cattle Company came forward within the week, one who had been present when the forgery was commissioned, and one who had witnessed the actual act, a clerk Croft had hired specifically for his skill at handwriting, and then threatened into silence. Their testimony was documented by the federal examiner and transmitted to the Austin office with Edgar's legal analysis attached. The case went before a federal judge in San Antonio in the 2nd week of September 1878, with Edgar and Frances both present to testify. Frances had never been to San Antonio before. The city was startling after months in redemption, large and crowded and full of the particular energy of a place where multiple worlds were meeting and mixing. Spanish colonial architecture, alongside Anglo commercial buildings, Mexican families and Anglo settlers and freedmen, all moving through the same streets in a negotiated coexistence that was imperfect but undeniably alive. They stayed at the Menger Hotel, which had opened just a few years earlier, and was the finest accommodation Frances had ever been in, with clean white walls and cool tiled floors and a dining room that served proper meals. Edgar had booked 2 separate rooms without discussion, which was appropriate, and Frances was simultaneously grateful for the propriety and aware of a complicated feeling she did not fully excavate. The day before the hearing, they walked the streets of San Antonio together in the cooling evening, past the old mission and along the river that wound through the center of the city, and Edgar told her what he expected the outcome to be. "The evidence is strong," he said. "The clerk's testimony is the cornerstone. The handwriting analysis, your father's letters, the documented refusal of the offer, it all builds around that testimony into something the judge will have difficulty ignoring." "Even with Croft's money." "Even with Croft's money," she echoed. "What happens to the land if the deed is overturned? It reverts to the estate, which means it reverts to you as primary heir. You will need to file for formal inheritance, which Thomas will need to sign off on as co-heir, but I have already prepared those documents. If the ruling goes our way, you could potentially be back on the property within a month." She thought about that. 300 acres of Texas hill country. The peach orchard along the creek bottom that would be bearing fruit right now, if anyone was there to pick it. The house her father had built with his own hands, the stone house that had taken him 3 summers because he had been doing it alone, cutting and laying each piece of limestone himself with a patient determination that Frances had always found equal parts admirable and heartbreaking. "Edgar," she said. "Yes. When this is over, what do you do?" He looked at her sideways as they walked along the river. "Continue practicing law, I suppose. Return to Redemption." "Why Redemption?" she asked. "It is a small town. You are good enough to practice anywhere." "I know it," he said simply. "I know the people there, even the difficult ones. I know where the courthouse steps are slippery when it rains. I know that the best coffee in town is at Mrs. Pullen's, but that she will only make it strong if you ask specifically." He paused. "And I know you are there." Frances stopped walking. He stopped too, a half step later, and turned to face her. And in the evening light of San Antonio, with the river moving quietly beside them and the old city settling into its night sounds around them, Frances Gentry looked at Edgar Hadley and understood that she had arrived at the edge of a decision. She had built walls over the years, not consciously, not as deliberate construction, but in the way that people who have lost many things build walls, incrementally, each loss adding another course of stone until the structure becomes automatic and unexamined. She had lost her mother young. She had lost her father to time and to illness. She had come close to losing the land that represented everything her father had built. She had understood, without quite articulating it, that caring deeply about things that could be taken was a form of vulnerability she could not afford. And then Edgar Hadley had walked into the picture, with his ink-stained fingers and his honest gray eyes and his refusal to pretend that he was not afraid, and the walls had been developing a considerable structural problem. "I need to say something clearly," she said, because Frances Gentry had always preferred clarity to implication, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond." "Of course," he said. "I have not made space in my life for this kind of thing in a long time," she said. "I have had good reasons for that. They have seemed good to me anyway. You know most of the practical situation, but what you may not know is that it is not only about the practical situation. It is about the habit of managing alone. It is about the fact that when someone becomes important to you and then leaves, or is taken, it is very difficult, and I have not wanted to be in that difficulty again." He waited, as she had asked. "But I have been thinking about what Thomas said to me, about waiting for clear water. And I think he is right. I think I have been using the difficulty as an excuse to avoid something that scares me, not because it is dangerous, but because it matters." She looked at him directly, the way she looked at things she was deciding to face. "You matter. This matters. I do not know exactly what to do with that yet, but I wanted to say it." Edgar was quiet for a moment. The river moved on beside them. "I have been in love with you," he said, with the precise, considered delivery of a man who has thought about words carefully, "since approximately the 4th week after we met, when you argued with me for 40 minutes about the admissibility of a character witness, and turned out to be correct. I have been trying to conduct myself appropriately given the circumstances of our professional relationship, and I have not always succeeded, as I believe you are aware." She almost smiled. "I am aware. I am not going anywhere," he said. "Not from redemption, not from your case, and not from whatever this is, if you will let me stay in it." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he covered it with his own, and they stood there in the San Antonio evening while the decision settled into something solid and permanent. "Stay," she said. He turned his face slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, and Frances felt it all the way through her. The court hearing the next day was 3 hours of testimony and legal argument, and Edgar at his most precise and devastating, disassembling Croft's defense with the careful efficiency of a man taking apart a machine he has already mapped completely. The clerk's testimony held under cross-examination. The handwriting analysis was entered into the record. Robert Gentry's letter refusing the sale was read aloud and entered as evidence with the dates clearly established. The federal judge, a lean and serious man named Hargrove who had seen enough frontier land fraud in his career to recognize its patterns immediately, ruled at 4:30 in the afternoon. The Croft deed was a forgery. It was void. The land reverted to the Gentry estate. Frances sat very still for a moment after the ruling. Then she pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed out slowly, and she felt the knot in her chest, the one that had lived there since the surveyor's man had come to her door, dissolve completely, like salt in warm water. Edgar's hand found hers under the table briefly and squeezed once. Silas Croft was remanded for trial on the forgery and fraud charges. His subsequent trial, held in January of 1879, resulted in a conviction and a 5-year sentence in the Texas State Penitentiary. Sheriff Dolan resigned his position before the trial, accepting a quiet arrangement that exchanged his testimony against Croft for the prosecutor's agreement not to pursue charges against him for his role in the concealment. Frances found this outcome incomplete, but understood it as the compromise that kept the larger conviction intact. She and Thomas returned to the Gentry land in late October of 1878. The house was intact, which was more than she had expected. Croft's people had not bothered to damage it, likely because they had assumed the forgery would hold and the property would be theirs clean. The orchard had gone unpicked and much of the fruit had fallen and composted itself back into the earth, which Thomas said, with a rancher's practical acceptance, was good for the soil and not a total loss. The house needed cleaning and some repair to the roof where a branch had come down in a summer storm, and the kitchen garden had gone completely to weeds, and the cattle that had been on the property when her father died had been absorbed into Croft's herd without record, which was a loss they would fight for in civil court. But the land was theirs. The limestone house with the deep-set windows and the covered porch was theirs. The 300 acres of hill country with the creek bottom and the peach orchard, and the view west across the rolling hills to where the sky came down and touched the earth was theirs. Frances stood on the porch on the first morning and watched the sun come up over the eastern hills and felt something she could not name, something that was not quite happiness because it was too large and too aching for that word, something closer to the feeling of putting down a weight you have carried so long you have forgotten you were carrying it. Edgar came 3 weeks later. He had not been able to leave immediately because there were post-trial filings to complete and the civil case regarding the cattle to begin, but he came on a Saturday in mid-November when the hill country had put on its autumn colors, the oaks gone russet and gold, and the grasses bleached to pale silver by the cooling air. Frances heard his horse coming up the road and went out to the porch to meet him. He looked different out here, away from town, without the office and the legal files and the framework of their professional context. He looked like a man who was seeing something he had not expected to want and was quietly surprised by the wanting. Thomas came out from the barn where he had been doing something with hinges and gave Edgar a handshake that was also a form of approval, conducted in the economical language of Texas men. They sat on the porch in the afternoon and talked, the three of them, and Frances made coffee and Thomas told stories about the cattle drive and Edgar listened with genuine interest. And the afternoon was easy and warm in the way that certain afternoons are gifts. Later, when Thomas had gone back to the barn and the evening was coming down soft and purple over the hills, Frances and Edgar sat alone on the porch and watched the last of the light leave the sky. "I would like to come back," he said. "Often if you will allow it. You could move your practice," she said. "There is no lawyer in the county since the redemption man left. You would have more work than you could manage." "That is a practical consideration," he said. "I am a practical woman." "You are," he agreed. "You are also the most remarkable person I have met in a considerable time." He said it simply, without self-consciousness, and the directness of it hit her the same way his directness always did, somewhere below the careful composure she wore as a matter of habit. "I do not want to rush you, Frances. I am aware that you have just gotten your land back and your life has been in upheaval for months. But I want you to know that what I feel for you is not a circumstance of convenience. It did not grow from the case. The case just gave me an excuse to be near you, and what happened from that nearness is something I believe is genuine and permanent." She turned to look at him in the fading light. His face was serious and open and entirely without performance. "I know," she said. "I feel it too, the same way. Genuine and permanent." She paused. "Stay for supper. Thomas has been experimenting with a bean recipe that is either very good or a disaster, and I would rather not evaluate it alone." He stayed for supper. Thomas's beans were, in fact, excellent, and he looked so privately pleased when they said so that Frances felt a rush of simple affection for her brother that surprised her with its intensity. This young man who was also an orphan now, also starting over, and who had chosen to start his over here, on this land, with his sister. Edgar began coming to the property every Saturday. By December, he had begun bringing his legal books, setting up a makeshift office at the dining table when the weather kept them inside, working on filings and briefs, while Frances did the ranch accounts at the same table, their papers occasionally mingling at the edges, their coffee cups leaving rings on the same table in the same way they had in his office above the hardware store. And this continuation felt right and necessary, the same rhythm in a different room. By Christmas, he was staying through Sunday, riding back to Redemption in the early Monday morning before the town fully woke. Thomas began treating this as an established arrangement, which it was, and no one commented on it because no one needed to. In January of 1879, while Silas Croft's trial was proceeding in San Antonio, Edgar came to the property on a Saturday that was cold and clear, with a blue-sky Texas winter day throwing sharp shadows across the limestone and the bare oak trees making dark lines against the light. Frances was in the barn when she heard him arrive, doing something practical with feed, and she came out and found him standing in the yard with his horse and an expression that was different from his usual arrival expression. He was nervous. She could see it in the way he was managing his hands, which was not a thing he usually had to manage. "What is it?" she said. "I have something I want to ask you," he said, "and I want to ask it properly, so I am going to take a moment to locate the correct words." She waited. He located them. "Frances Gentry," he said, "I have spent a considerable portion of my adult life in motion, looking for a place and a life that felt like mine. I have found it here. Not just the geography, but the particular arrangement of things that includes you and this land and the work we do together, and the fact that you argue with me when I am wrong, which is something I did not know I needed until I had it. I would like to stop moving. I would like to build something here that lasts." He reached into his coat pocket, I bought this in San Antonio last month. I have been carrying it since, trying to find the moment, which I am told is something a man tends to overthink. The ring was simple and lovely, a fine gold band set with a small garnet that caught the winter light and held it. "Will you marry me?" he said. Frances looked at the ring and at the man holding it, standing in the yard of her father's land in the January sun, nervous and earnest and entirely himself. "Yes," she said, "I will, without any reservations." He smiled then, the full, unguarded smile that she had seen so rarely in the months of difficulty that its appearance now felt like a kind of weather change, like the sun after a long storm. He put the ring on her finger, and she took his face in both hands and kissed him there in the yard properly, in the cold winter light. Thomas came out of the house at that moment, because he had been watching through the window, and he said something about not being surprised and also something about time, and Edgar laughed, and Frances told Thomas to go back inside, and Thomas did not go back inside but congratulated them both instead with the warmth of a young man who genuinely meant it. They were married in March of 1879 in the county seat, by a judge who was not Judge Paris, who had himself been removed from the bench pending an investigation into his 14 consecutive rulings in favor of Croft. The ceremony was small, Thomas standing for Edgar, Frances's friend and neighbor Mrs. Delacroix, who ran a small farm 2 miles east, standing for Frances. The day was cool and bright, and Frances wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, a practical decision, and also, she had allowed, an aesthetically satisfying one. Edgar said his vows with the same measured precision he brought to everything important, which Frances had come to understand was not coldness but its opposite, a form of deep seriousness that reserved itself for things that mattered. She said hers with equal precision, looking at him directly throughout, because she had decided that she was going to mean every word, and she wanted him to see that she did. Afterward, they all had dinner at the hotel dining room in the county seat, Thomas and Mrs. Delacroix, and then returned to the Gentry land as evening came on. Edgar moved his practice formally to the county in April. He kept a small office in town, but did most of his work from the house now, which had a second room that they converted for his books and files. The same towers of organized chaos he had maintained above the hardware store in Redemption, transported and reinstalled in limestone walls. Frances found she liked having his books around, liked the particular weight and presence of them. The civil case over the stolen cattle resolved in June 1879 with a partial victory. They recovered the monetary value of 2/3 of the cattle through a settlement, which Croft's legal representatives negotiated from the penitentiary, rather than face a trial that would have produced additional unflattering evidence. It was not everything, but it was enough to reinvest in new stock, and by the end of summer they had a working cattle herd again. Thomas proved to have a genuine talent for ranch management that had been somewhat obscured by his previous need to keep moving on cattle drives. With the land secure and his role defined, he settled into it with an industry and intelligence that surprised Frances slightly, though perhaps it should not have. He was, after all, Robert Gentry's son as much as she was Robert Gentry's daughter. The autumn of 1879 was beautiful. The hill country did what it does when everything is right, turned gold and russet and amber under a sky so blue it seemed architectural, and the creek ran clear and full from September rains, and the peach orchard, picked for the first time in 2 years, produced more fruit than Frances had expected. She put up preserves for 3 days running and sent jars of them to Mrs. Pullen at the boarding house in Redemption and to Mrs. Delacroix and to the Federal Examiner in Austin because she thought he deserved peach preserves. In the evenings, Edgar read to her by the fire Tennyson and other things, and they argued about poetry with the particular pleasure of two people who disagree well. And the house felt different than it had in all the years she had grown up in it, not better than it had been with her father, just different, fuller, occupied in a new way. She told him in November that she was expecting a child. Edgar received this information in silence for a moment that was long enough that she started to wonder whether she had miscommunicated something, and then he stood up from his chair and came to her and held her with a completeness that answered every question she had not known she was asking. "We should write to Thomas," he said into her hair. "He is in the next room," she said, slightly muffled. "Shouting through the wall seems undignified. They told Thomas at breakfast." He put down his fork and looked at both of them with an expression that moved through several recognizable stages before settling on something that looked like uncomplicated joy. The baby came in July of 1880, on a warm morning when the creek was running low, and the cicadas were making their high summer sound in the oaks. It was a boy, healthy and loud from his first breath, with Edgar's dark hair and Frances's set, determined mouth already apparent in miniature. They named him Robert James Hadley, Robert for Frances's father and James for Edgar's, a naming that felt like a proper honoring of the people who had made them. Edgar held his son with the expression of a man encountering something for which his legal training had provided no preparation, something that bypassed every framework he had built and arrived directly at the part of him that was undefended. Frances watched him and felt something she had no word for, something that was love but also larger than that word, something that included Robert James and Edgar and the limestone house and the peach orchard and all of it together, everything that had been fought for and survived and built. Thomas became an uncle with enormous seriousness, which made Edgar and Frances both laugh, because Thomas was 24 years old and treating the business of unclehood with the same focused intensity he brought to cattle management. The years that followed had the texture of real life, which is to say they were full of ordinary things and occasional extraordinary ones, woven together in a way that did not resolve neatly into a single dominant note, but hummed with the combination of all of them. Edgar's practice grew steadily, and he developed a reputation in the county for the same quality Frances had recognized from the beginning. He was honest and he was excellent, and he did not work with people who lied. He won cases and lost some, and the ones he lost troubled him in the way that things trouble a person who takes their work seriously. And Frances listened to him work through them in the evenings, with the same attention she would have brought to a legal brief, which she had discovered she had a genuine interest in, sufficient that Edgar began consulting her on the strategic dimensions of cases in a way that was unofficial but genuine. She ran the ranch with Thomas in the practical, competent way that she had run things all her life, but with a different quality to it now, lighter somehow, because the anxiety of potential loss had been replaced by the steady confidence of actual possession. In the spring of 1882, Frances discovered she was expecting again, and this time it was a girl, born in December with a full head of dark hair and eyes that would settle eventually into hazel, a combination of both of them. They named her Clara Ruth Hadley, Ruth for Edgar's mother, which pleased him in a way he expressed quietly but completely. Robert, who was 2 when Clara arrived, regarded his sister with the wary assessment of a person whose previously adequate situation has been altered without his consultation, and then gradually came to accept and eventually to champion her with the loyal fierceness of an older brother who has decided, once decided, to be fully committed. Edgar watched this development with quiet amusement, and once said to Frances that Robert reminded him of Thomas, which was accurate, and which Thomas accepted as the compliment it was intended to be. Thomas himself had, by 1882, become engaged to a woman named Margaret Pierce, who had come to the county from Tennessee with her widowed mother, and had been running a small dry goods enterprise in town with a practicality and humor that Thomas found entirely compelling. Frances liked Margaret immediately, which was not something she had assumed would happen, but which resolved itself clearly in the first hour of their acquaintance. Margaret was direct and funny, and had no patience for nonsense, which meant she and Frances got along in the effortless way of people who share a fundamental temperament. Thomas and Margaret were married in the spring of 1883, on the Gentry land, in the peach orchard when the trees were in bloom, a ceremony that was larger than Edgar and Frances's had been and considerably louder, because Margaret had a large family in Tennessee who had all come for the occasion, and who brought with them a celebratory energy that filled the whole property for 3 days. At the wedding, Edgar stood next to Frances in the orchard while the ceremony was happening, and he put his arm around her waist in the unceremonious, entirely certain way that had replaced the early careful deliberateness between them, the gesture of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to be, and Frances leaned into him with the equivalent certainty, and they watched her brother marry a good woman in a peach orchard that their father had planted with his own hands. There was something in that moment that Frances wanted to name correctly, so she turned it over in her mind while the ceremony went on, while Thomas said his vows in his quiet, serious way, and Margaret said hers with the slight tremor of genuine feeling that moved through her usual composure. What it was, she decided, was gratitude. Not the tentative, anxious gratitude of someone who expects the good thing to be taken away, but the deep, settled gratitude of someone who has kept something hard-won long enough to know it is truly theirs. The land was theirs. The house was theirs. The orchard was here and producing and real. Robert was 4 years old and currently asleep in Mrs. Delacroix's lap at the edge of the gathering. Clara was in the arms of Margaret's mother, looking around at the orchard with the alert, wondering expression of a 7-month-old discovering the existence of blossoms. And Edgar was here, solid and steady beside her, his arm around her waist, his gray eyes soft in the spring light, and they had built this together from a beginning that had been nothing but a forged document and a creaky staircase, and a desk full of papers and 2 people who had decided, not all at once but consistently and over time, that the thing growing between them was worth tending. "What are you thinking about?" Edgar asked quietly under the cover of the ceremony's final words. "Gratitude," she said. He looked at her and understood, the way he understood most of what she meant, not because he read minds but because he had paid attention for years now, had accumulated her the way a good lawyer accumulates evidence, piece by piece until the picture was complete. "Yes," he said simply. It was enough. After the wedding celebration wound down and the Tennessee relatives departed, and Thomas and Margaret settled into the life they were making, the Hadley household continued in its established patterns with the gradual, accumulating richness of shared years. Robert grew into a serious and curious boy, deeply interested in his father's law books in the way that children are interested in things they see the adults in their lives caring about, spending afternoons with his nose in volumes that were far beyond his reading level, asking questions with an intensity that Edgar always took seriously, answering carefully, explaining the pieces that could be explained, and saying honestly when a thing required more years to understand. Clara grew into a girl of considerable personality, opinionated from early on, with Frances's directness and Edgar's precision, a combination that was occasionally exhausting and always impressive. She attached herself to Thomas with the devotion of a niece who has identified her favorite uncle, which Thomas handled with the perfect mixture of indulgence and discipline. In 1885, Frances and Edgar had a 3rd child, another boy, whom they named Daniel Edgar Hadley, Eddie to everyone who knew him, a name he inhabited with the same easy confidence with which he inhabited every space he entered. He was the extrovert of the family, where Robert was interior and Clara was sharp. Eddie was open and warm, the one who made friends in 10 minutes and remembered every name. By the late 1880s, the railroad had reached the county, as everyone had known it would, and the value of the hill country land had increased substantially. Edgar handled several land cases for neighboring ranchers during this period, the legal landscape becoming complicated as railroad surveyors and speculators repeated, in various forms, the tactics that Silas Croft had deployed a decade earlier. Edgar won most of them. Frances sat in on the significant ones when she could, and occasionally offered strategic observations that were consistently useful enough that Edgar began specifically making time to discuss the cases with her before major hearings. "You should have studied law," he said one evening, not for the first time. "It was not an available option when I was of the age to study anything," she said. "There are women lawyers now, not many but some." "I know, I read about them." She looked at him over the papers between them. "I am a rancher, and apparently an informal legal strategist for my husband." "You are an excellent informal legal strategist," he said. "I want that to be recognized." "It is recognized," she said, "by the person whose recognition matters." He smiled at that, the full, unguarded smile she had been seeing for a decade now and which still struck her as a gift every time it appeared. Silas Croft was released from the Texas State Penitentiary in the fall of 1884, having served his sentence. Frances was told of his release by a letter from the federal marshal's office, which Edgar had arranged to have sent to them as a matter of information. She read the letter and thought about it for a day, and then put it away. Whatever Croft was now, he was a convicted man without his land empire, his political connections shredded by the conviction, his financial power largely dismantled by the civil cases and the legal fees and the years of incarceration. He was no longer a threat in any practical sense. She did not wish him well, but she no longer carried the weight of active opposition to him, and that release was its own form of freedom. Thomas and Margaret had their first child in 1884, a boy they named Robert after Frances and Thomas's father, creating the pleasant confusion of two cousins named Robert in the same extended family, which was resolved by distinguishing them as Robert James and Robert Thomas respectively. Margaret was an energetic and devoted mother, and Thomas was a father of the same precise and committed type he had been as a brother, and Frances watched them build their family with the warm, uncomplicated pleasure of someone who wants good things for the people she loves. By 1888, the extended Gentry Hadley household on those 300 acres of hill country had become a world unto itself. Frances and Edgar in the main house with Robert, who was 8, Clara, who was 6, and Eddie, who was 3. Thomas and Margaret in the house they had built at the north end of the property, which had been Frances's wedding gift to Thomas, the deed to 40 acres of the land, a gift Edgar had supported entirely. The two houses shared the orchard and the creek and the road and the life of the place, and on Sundays the families ate together on the long table Thomas had built under the large live oak near the creek, and the children ran the property in the way that children run through familiar land, with the easy ownership of belonging. Frances sat at that table on a Sunday in October of 1888, watching her family in the golden afternoon light, watching Robert help Eddie with something at the creek's edge, while Clara supervised from a rock with the authority of someone several decades older, watching Margaret and Thomas argue cheerfully about something inconsequential, watching Margaret's small daughter Anna, 2 years old and enormously determined, attempt to follow her older cousins to the creek, and being gently redirected by Thomas, without interrupting his argument with Margaret. Edgar was beside her, their shoulders touching in the comfortable proximity of people who have shared space long enough that physical nearness is simply the natural state. He was reading something, a brief probably because he was never entirely without work, but his attention was partly here, in the way it always was, distributed between the work and the life happening around him. "Edgar," she said, "do you remember the Saloon?" He looked up from the brief, understanding immediately what she was referring to, vividly. "I was terrified," she said. "I did not show it. I know, I could tell anyway." He set the brief down. "I was also terrified, considerably so. And yet. He looked out at the creek where the children were, at the orchard beyond, at the limestone house they had built their life inside. It worked out remarkably well, given the starting conditions. Frances thought about all the starting conditions: the forged deed and the crooked sheriff and the creaking stairs and the lamplit evenings with the legal papers between them, and the creek walk and his hand in hers, and the ring in the January light, and the baby who was now 8 years old telling his little brother something important at the water's edge. "Remarkably well," she agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned in against his side, and the afternoon light slanted across the table and the orchard and the children and the creek, and all of it was theirs, earned and permanent and whole. There was nothing left to fight for, and Frances Gentry, who had spent so many years defined by what she was fighting against, found that this absence was the most complete and extraordinary thing she had ever been given. She had come to redemption looking for justice, with her father's letters and her anger and her absolute refusal to yield. She had found justice. She had found the land and the house and the peach orchard restored to life. She had also found something she had not been looking for and had not known how to want, something that had arrived sideways and built itself quietly while she was occupied with other things, something she would not trade for any amount of the careful, managed solitude she had previously mistaken for strength. She had found Edgar, and Edgar had found her, and in the finding they had made a life that held all of it together. The land and the work and the children and the long evenings by the fire and the arguments about poetry and the Sunday tables under the live oak, and the particular, irreplaceable texture of a love that had been tested in its beginning and had held, and gone on holding, through every season that followed. The hill country evening came on slowly, the sky going from gold to amber to the deep, soft purple that preceded the stars, and the children came up from the creek, and Margaret called for everyone to come to supper, and the small civilization of the extended family gathered itself at the long table under the oak. Frances stood and helped Edgar collect his papers, and they walked together to the table, and she looked at his face in the evening light, familiar and dear and entirely known, and felt again that thing that was larger than the word happiness but included it, that deep and solid sense of a life that was exactly what it was meant to be. Robert James Hadley, age 8, tall for his age and serious about it, sat beside his father and asked a question about property law that made Edgar put down his fork and give it the full consideration it was clearly due. Clara, 6 and immovable, sat beside her mother and told her something about what she had observed at the creek, a creature of some kind, described with the precise vocabulary of a child who paid close attention to the world. Eddie, 3 and currently more interested in Margaret's cornbread than in anything else, occupied his chair with the satisfied presence of someone who has found the best spot at the table and knows it. Thomas said something that made Margaret laugh, and the sound of it traveled down the table and bounced back from the oak leaves above, and Anna made a sound of pure baby delight at nothing in particular, and the first stars appeared in the sky above the hill country. Frances Gentry Hadley, on 300 acres of limestone and peach orchard and creek bottom in central Texas, in the year 1888, looked at the table full of her family and felt the last of everything she had ever carried dissolve into the evening. She had started with a forged document and a righteous fury, and a set of stairs she was not certain would hold her weight. She had ended with this. It was, she thought, with the quiet and complete certainty of someone who has been through enough to know what mattered, more than enough. It was everything.